You see it?
I do see it.
Awesome. So for the first part of the program tonight, again, Christine and I are going to kind of cover aspects of plant growth. My name is Jeff McCutcheon. I'm an associate professor and also the director of operations for Extension in Ohio. So this evening in the first part, we're going to cover plant anatomy, plant physiology, and then Christine's going to get the funner topics of categorizing forages by life cycle and taxonomy and managing pasture growth. So hopefully this picture's been around for quite a while, this drawing, but this is a basic rendering of a grass plant. And grass plants have a lot of things in common. But we're going to cover some of the various aspects. So, grasses may have rhizomes, which are underground stems. They are capable of rooting and sending up nodes for vegetative production. One common grass that I know that has rhizomes, Johnson grass is one that easily comes to mind. A stolon is another prostate stem. This one runs on top of the ground. And for most of our pastures, the plant we can easily identify stolons on is actually not a grass, but our white clover is one we can easily identify stolons on. Something else to keep in mind is all the grass plants have a crown at the base of the plant near the soil surface. Depending on the plant, it may be above the soil surface or slightly below. But this is a really important zone to pay attention to in grass anatomy, because this is where all the basal meristems, or all the places where the buds for new stems, new leaves. For some grasses, this is where carbohydrates are stored over winter to help the plant survive winter. So it's a lot of the growth tissue associated with our grass plants. So the crown is an important region. Another one, we have these collars. Easy to identify when you've looked at a stem. You can see those bumps in the tissue. It's where the leaf attaches, and this is another growth point on our grass plants. This is where the leaf meristem, or they call it intercalary meristem, but this is the area where the growth actually happens with new leaves. If you ever notice that you cut off the tip of a leaf on a grass plant and it continues to grow, it doesn't grow a new tip, it just grows longer, and it's coming from this region. All right, a meristem is basically the area or the cells that are capable of growth, so division. We also have a leaf sheath, so anytime the leaf comes off the stem, it's actually attached lower at the meristem or the collar region, and then it comes out to capture sunlight. Leaf blades, these are extremely important because this is the most nutritious part of the plant. And it's also the plant where the photosynthesis happens, which we'll cover a little bit later. Culm is just a fancy term for the central axis of a mature plant. It composes all of the central stem, the node, the flag leaf. A lot of times we talk about the boot stage, and the boot stage is the reproductive stage where the flower is encased within a leaf. It's that flower leaf, so it's the last leaf basically before the seed head. And add a few more terms here. I think that's it. So we've got a lot of terms associated with the inflorescence, basically the seed head and flower structure. A lot of this will be used to help identify different species. So you've got the punicle inflorescence are rachii and spikelet. And we're going to switch gears a little bit. Another few important terms to think about is the leaf blade, or called lamina, and that's typically the part right above the collar. The collar is that meristematic tissue again, where the blade will grow from. Auricles are these little claw appendages at the base of the blade. These can be used to help identify grass plants. Some have auricles, some don't. Some have clasping. So those are structures that may help identify what type of grass you are looking at. Another structure, the ligule, is an outgrowth at the interjunction of the leaf sheath and blade. Sometimes it can be membranous, sometimes it's a fringe of hairs, sometimes it doesn't exist. So, auricles and the ligule are terms that people use to help classify and identify what the actual plant is. And finally, on the leaf, the sheath is the lower part of the leaf that actually encloses the stem or the internode. Legumes have somewhat similar anatomy, but not quite. I mentioned rhizomes and stolons, and this is a rendering of a white clover. So the stem of the white clover is actually laying on the ground as a stolon. Some legumes have a main taproot. White clover does not, but alfalfa is one that you would think of as having a major taproot. Nodules. Our legumes have a symbiotic relationship with a bacteria called rhizobium, and rhizobium is actually the bacteria that helps capture and convert nitrogen from the air. So it's we talk about legumes adding nitrogen to the soil. It's that symbiotic relationship with the rhizobia that do that. And these are little white capsules, nodules on the roots. When you dig up roots and gently pull the soil away, you'll see them as little white dots. Stipules, legumes don't have a collar region, but they have stipules where the leaf attaches to the stem. And then the leaves, one interesting aspect with white clover is the part you see up in the grass canopy is actually the leaf structure, not the stem. So that is a little bit of variation. Other anatomy, inflorescence, the flowers look different. They look more like flowers. They're made up of florets and not spikelets. Sometimes we use those to help identify the differences in plants based on color, red clover, white clover. It kind of gives you the hint what color flower it has. In our pastures, we also have something called forbs. Forbs, sometimes people call them herbs, or they are herbaceous, not woody, but they're broadleaf plants that don't either fit legumes or grass-like structures. Typically, we'll see these as annuals or in mixtures. Some can be used to fill seasonal gaps. Some are short-lived perennials, but they typically have a high quality for grazing. Examples, typically brassicas, chicory. There are some broadleaf weeds like plantain that have been bred for forages. Some, like Christine's picture here, with brassicas, not only the leaf but also the bulb or taproot can also be edible. So all those structures are to help the plant convert solar energy to chemical energy. This is the basic science of agriculture, converting carbon dioxide and water into carbohydrates and oxygen. It occurs in the chloroplast. There are 3 photosynthetic pathways, C3, C4, and CAM. We're really kind of focused in grazing. We focus on the C3s, which are cool season grass plants. One reason they're called cool season is they like optimal growth temperatures, daytime temperatures of 65 to 70, nighttime temperatures in the 50s. And C4 plants typically optimum growth temperature is 85 to 95. Nighttime temperatures can be in the upper 60s and 70s. The most common C4 plant in Ohio is maize or corn. But C4 gives those plants a little greater water use, greater drought tolerance, and accelerated growth rates. I've joked that certain weather conditions in midsummer, you can actually hear the corn growing at night as the leaves unfurl. So for plant physiology, growth either aids energy capture or storage. So the roots, leaves, and stems are either to help with energy capture, capturing the sunlight and then turning it into carbohydrates, or storage. Leaves are the main factor. We like green leaf. They have the greatest nutritional value to livestock. So we want to manage for healthy leaf tissue and also healthy root tissue. We need to understand that overgrazing stresses the root system. If you take over 50% of the green leaf area, you're going to stop root growth. Undergrazing will accelerate the entrance into reproductive phase. So if we let the plants go longer, they will more likely move toward reproductive phase. Management intensive grazing allows for adequate rest for the root system and meristems and gives things time to regrow. So we have an example, and this came from Dr. Smith, grad student Shear, and Dr. Keene out of University of Kentucky. Now, they treated these plants the same for most of its growth, but 4 weeks before this picture were taken, they treated the one on the left as a continuous grazing. So they clipped it to 1 inch, and then every week they clipped that plant on the left down to 1 inch of height. And this is an orchard grass plant. The one on the right, at the beginning, they clipped it 3.5 inches. For the next 4 weeks, they let it grow, and then they clipped it again at 4.5 inches. So these pictures are the day one after that, the second clipping of the rotational grazing. So the continuous grazing on the left has had 4 clippings. So if you look at the initial picture, in day 2, you already start to see some growth. If you look real hard, you can see some growth in the continuous grazing, but it's noticeable in the rotational grazing. Day 3, the difference becomes more pronounced. Day 4, day 5, and day 6. By leaving that extra leaf area in the rotational grazing, allowing the roots to recover, that plant has been able to regrow faster than its neighbor on the left. The reproductive stage of forage plants, all forage plants try to produce seed. There are a lot of factors on when they go to reproductive stage, plant type, environment. It's always good to remember that forage quality is best before the reproductive stage of the plant. Forage quality can decline rapidly depending on the species of forage. And that stage for grasses is prior to boot. For legumes, it's bud to early bloom. When the reproductive stage is reached, the plant shifts its resources to from the leaf and stem to seed production. And some grasses will actually shut down or retard basically the any basal buds from sprouting. All right, and now let's switch over to Christine. She's going to cover life cycle and how it plays a role. And I will stop sharing.
That's right. We're going to switch over to my presentation here shortly. Just a couple things to note. Everything should have been sent to your home if you had paid before last week for the course. So hopefully everything has been received at your house. And also wanted to share quickly that we had a really successful social hour the other evening, and everyone determined that they would like to have that event again. So we would love to provide that. And Erica has put together a survey link so that you can go and take the survey to indicate what date would be best for you to participate. Erica, when you're available to do that, would you please put the link in the chat box again? And we will encourage everybody to share what date is most conducive. Let's make sure here that you're seeing my correct screen. Are you seeing text life cycle classifications?
Yes.
Okay, excellent. So here we go. Now that we know a bit more about the ins and outs of plant science and how these plants grow and what's most important so that they can actually get through life, we're going to talk about how, as forage managers, we tend to classify these plants. And one of the primary ways that we sort these plants out is by life cycle. And as Jeff just said, the rate at which these plants reach maturity, reproductive maturity, varies depending on their life cycles. So annual crops, these are plants that are, the way I like to think of it is these are on the fast and the furious track. They are trying to go to seed as quickly as possible and leave behind that next generation of seed in their wake. Biennials are a bit different. These plants are going to complete their life cycle in 2 years. The first year, they will only put out vegetative growth. And in the second year, they will actually flower and then produce seed. There are a lot of biennials in forage production that we actually use as annual crops instead of as biennials because we don't have a need for them to go to seed. So usually these biennial crops that are listed as examples are actually used as annuals. And then when it comes to perennials, these are more the slow and steady wins the race kind of plants. These are going to take a longer time to establish roots and vegetative tissue, but once they do, they're going to hang out for the long term. Year after year, these plants will come back from the root tissue and produce again. This is probably the class of or classification of plants that you're most familiar with in grazing situations. They are often the ones that grandpa had, that you still have, that you are still managing, or the ones that you're considering refreshing in your pastures. But there's a place for all of these different classifications of plants in a grazing system. And as we saw on the growth curve of warm season and cool season plants, we also are able to fill those gaps in production with annuals, biennials, or perennial plants. So let's talk some more about those annual plants. We can classify them into two categories of either summer annuals or winter annuals. And name implies our summer annuals are those that will grow when the temperatures are pretty warm. Usually we will see most of the growth occur in the state of Ohio between the months of May and October. In order to get this seed to germinate and take off, we need to have soil temperatures that are above 65 degrees to get good germination. And then our winter annuals, they're kind of the opposite. These plants are going to grow vegetatively in the fall, and then they'll pause their growth through the winter and resume again in the spring. In this category, like I mentioned, we group our biennial brassicas that we use for forage production in this group as winter annuals. And our small grains are usually in this category, but we also have some other winter annual plants that are less commonly used, including legumes like crimson clover, hairy vetch, winter pea, and then our brassicas as well. In many cases, if you are in the process of rejuvenating a stand or renovating a stand, you can use annuals as a cover crop while you prepare the site. And many of these can also be used as smother crops to help control weeds, along with helping fill the forage gap if you have a time period where you don't have enough pasture for grazing animals. Another classification here, when we break down our two types of perennial plants, we tend to talk about our warm season perennials and our cool season perennials. And as you heard in Jeff's portion of the presentation, our warm season perennials are those that thrive when the temperature is between 85 and 95 degrees. And we'll see most of the growth of these plants happen between June and September. Some examples of these are the native warm season grasses that are often promoted for filling the forage gap long term or for conservation purposes. Indian grass, blue stem, switchgrass, eastern gamma grass, and in some cases, Bermuda grass. I know we have some people joining us in Pastures for Profit that are not from Ohio, and Bermuda grass may be more common in the area where you live. In Ohio, it tends to struggle to persist through the winter. So I do not recommend it to producers in Ohio, but there are some cases where it has been successful. But if you live in an area where your low winter temperature dips below -10, Bermuda grass probably won't make it. So it's a bit of a risky bet, but sometimes pays off. Our cool season perennials, these are the plants that grow when the temperatures are cool, usually having a flush of growth beginning in March, April, and then once we get to June, they begin to decline as the air temperature goes up, and sometimes our conditions get drier. It's hard to predict what the weather will do now. Um, could be wet, could be dry, but this is still the pattern that we see happen. And then these plants resume growth again in the fall, typically between the months of September and November. We get a second flush of growth. And examples of plants that fit in this category include the very commonly used white and red clovers, alfalfa, orchard grass, our fescues, Timothy, Kentucky blue, and smooth brome grass as another example. There are many examples. These are just a sampling. It looks like I'm playing the same slide again. My apologies for that. Let's move on. Let's talk a little bit about taxonomy. I'm going to try to open the chat box here so that I can see what you guys answer because I have a quiz for you. How many of you remember high school biology, maybe college biology, where you learned about Linnaeus and his taxonomic classifications of living things? We're going to talk some about the taxonomic classifications and why these are important when we're talking about forage crops. So as I go through the next series of clicks, I want you to type in the chat box what plant you think is the example. When we look at taxonomic classification, we start with kingdom. Now, all plants are in the plantae kingdom. Our phylum. I'm not going to say all of these words just in case I mispronounce them and I get embarrassed. But these are sexually reproducing plants. Then our classes, like these are dicot plants. Okay, so these are the official names of these classes, phylums, and kingdoms, but you may know them more commonly as dicots. Anybody have guesses yet? What plant this might be? Then it goes to order and then family. Most likely, when you are looking at forage crops, you're going to be looking for plants in a certain family, genus, and species. Anybody have a guess? And then, depending on how much research has been done on the seed, you will likely have a wide variety of varieties or cultivars to choose from. Does anyone know what plant this is used as the example? Yes, Jessica was first in the chat. It is alfalfa. So Harvextra is a developed variety of alfalfa. So when you're going through and trying to decide which plant fits your system best, make sure that you know the scientific name along with the common name because it can get confusing when you go to pick out the exact type that works for you. Sometimes the common names are interchanged between different plants, but if you know the genus, the species, and the variety or cultivar that you're looking for, well, one, you'll sound really smart at the feed and seed store, but two, it's going to help make sure that you get the product you're actually looking for. So here's my message from Taxonomy for tonight. Know these names before you go shopping because it can get confusing if you're trying to figure it out while you're standing in the store. It's important to remember that all forages are not created equal. As we've talked about, the different types of plants tonight and their physiological differences and morphological differences, there are concerns related with each type of plant. What they need or what they want to be most successful in your grazing system will vary. They will have different seeding times depending on what type of growth habit they have or what type of their cool season or a warm season. They Many of them will have different fertility needs because they allocate nutrients differently. Harvest height is something that needs to be paid attention to in a grazing situation as well as a hay system. For example, most of our warm season forage crops need to be harvested at about 8 inches if you intend to get really good regrowth on those stands when we're talking about those native perennial warm seasons. And many of our cool season plants should be grazed no lower than 3 inches. So pay attention to the specific height of the meristem of your plants, as you can see on the chart that Jeff shared early on in the presentation, so that you don't inadvertently damage that critical growth point on the plant. If you do, the stand will struggle to recover from that. And then also pay attention to their ability to be compatible with other plants in the stand. When we look at filling the forage gap with different types of plants, we know we have that summer slump when we're dealing with cool season plants. It looks really appealing to fill the gap with warm season plants. But when used in combination in the same paddock or hayfield, they often are not compatible with one another and they compete with each other. So pay attention to how well these plants complement each other in the pasture situation. Getting close to closing here, I want to remind everyone that when we talked about the rate of maturity and the speed of growth, when we are trying to make the best of both worlds, we need to remember that best quality is not the same as maximum yield. We're trying to find the balance between quality and yield. We want to have enough feed for our livestock, but we want that feed to be good quality because what good is having a whole bunch of forage that's not worth eating? We want to make sure that we are frequently surveying the pasture and also monitoring the condition of our animals, which we will get into next, so that we can decide when it's time to rotate within the pasture. And then also, that's going to help us stay ahead of weeds and it's going to help us take better care of our soils too. Some other key tips for you are just be a good pasture manager. And how do we do that? We do that by allowing enough space for the number of animals that we have and giving that space adequate rest between grazing events. As we saw in the greenhouse example, it takes time for plants to grow back. And the better we manage them during grazing, the easier it will be for them to regrow as well. We're going to talk more about how waste accumulates in specific areas of the pasture in our fence and water talk. We want to try to avoid concentrating our animals in those areas and then make sure that we are grazing to appropriate heights. That's what's best both for our animals and for our plants. If you have any questions about tonight's presentation, either for myself or for Jeff, please feel free to reach out, use the Q&A box, use the chat, or you can email us or call us as well. Most of the videos from the Forage Focus program are included as part of the course curriculum, but if you just can't get enough of forages, I welcome you to check out our Forage Focus playlist. You can scan the QR code on the screen if you'd like. There are now 30 episodes available of Forage Focus for you to learn more about your specific interests. And with that, I will end and stop sharing my screen, and we'll get ready for our next set of presentations.
Hey, Christine, do you want to answer questions in between presentations or do you want to wait until the end?
Let's go ahead and answer one while we get ready for our next presentation, which is meeting animal requirements on pasture. So we're going to start with Steve on that presentation. While Steve gets his screen ready to share, I see it there. Yeah, or what's our question, Erica? Could you read it to me?
Yeah, quick question related to grass plants going to seed. Are there ever times where you would want to let that happen? For example, to allow some natural reseeding of the pasture?
That's a good question, Scott. And Jeff, you can weigh in on this with me. Yes, there are times where you may want that to happen or allow that to happen. But you certainly don't want to get to that point while you have animals actively grazing. And it does depend too on how concerning that is, depending on which type of plant we're talking about. So there are some plants that are really good at self-seeding, and that would help thicken up the stand. And brush hogging from time to time, if the pasture gets a little bit away from you, you can go ahead and brush hog the stand and help get some of that seed back into the soil. Of course, the seed is not going to successfully germinate if it's not fully filled and dried too. So it's hard to get the conditions perfectly right for the production of seed while also trying to manage what's best for the animals. But yeah, there are situations where that could be a benefit for you. What do you think, Jeff?
Yeah, I agree, but it needs to be part of the. It's not the most efficient, um, and we have a lot of um, high quality forages that have been bred over time, and so we've got a lot better options nowadays than just what's out there in the pasture. So that's another consideration. Um, Most of the seedings of pastures or generations ago. So we have the opportunity for better genetics in our plant species now. So that would be one thing to weigh against it. I do remember, I think it was bird's foot trefoil that was a recommendation in helping get it established. Um, Letting it go to seed occasionally, but for most of our grasses, I would tell you to look at some of the newer cultivars that are out there and think about, opportunity to improve the genetics of your plants.
All right. Thank you, Jeff. And thank you, everybody, for listening. We're going to go ahead now with our next presentation. Steve, you have the floor.
All right, thank you. I'm Steve Boyles, the Beef Cattle Extension Specialist. And I heard Jeff just mention improve the genetics of your forage. I totally agree with that. I'm going to come from a different angle here, though. We need to find the proper genetics for the forage that we can provide. What we're doing here is we're going to feed two different cows. You've had time to look at the screen. These are both 1,300-pound cows. And I'd like them to kind of maintain their weight at about 1,300 pounds. They have a condition score of 5. Erica's going to explain what that is a little bit later here, but that's basically an average condition. The biggest difference between these two cows is daily milk production. The cow on the left-hand side of the screen produces about 10 pounds of milk per day. That's on the low side. Don't want to say that that's unusual, but that's a little bit lower. Whereas the cow on the right, she has the genetic material to produce 18 pounds of milk per day. So 18, 20, 21 would be a really high milking cow. So we're going to move through these cows. And these are the basic requirements. The cow on the left, dry matter. She can eat 23 pounds of dry matter a day. If you take out all the water of feed that's dry matter. So she eats about 23. Now the cow on the right that had the 18 pounds of milk production, it's not much different, but it's a little bit more. Also, correspondingly, the net energy maintenance, think of it as just energy, that 0.569 megacows per pound, she needs that much energy in a pound of feed. Now the energy on the cow on the right, it's 0.72, so it's higher per unit. She needs to consume more energy per pound of her consumption. Similarly with crude protein, only a little bit above 9% protein. That's the minimum this cow needs to just kind of survive. Whereas the cow on the right, that higher milk production, she needs a little over 11% crude protein in her diet, everything she consumes. Yeah, there's things there on minerals, but we're gonna not necessarily focus on that tonight. Then these are the feeds that have been made available to feed this cow. There's some corn, then there's some distiller's grains, there's some fescue hay if we absolutely need it. I put $1,000 a ton on that. Computer's not going to want to use it at all. Then there's a grass clover pasture, kind of some of the discussion that just previously happened, but it's the same feed on each side. And finally, there's some soybean meal in there if that's a better price compared to something else. So we've got these feeds. What we're going to do is feed these cows now. Now the cow on the right, the lower milk production, 10 pounds of milk per head per day. We see there's as fed, that's probably the number maybe easier to understand. She can consume almost 100 pounds of wet pasture. It's amazing how much they can eat out there, but she's going to be fine doing that. And there's the dry matter we were talking about, more for kind of nutrition folks like me. But TARS filler, what the heck's that? It's nothing. That's basically saying this cow can do just fine on the pasture out there, and she's going to eat some more pasture. She's going to maintain that condition score of 5. All we really need to provide to this cow is, a free choice mineral supplement, and she's going to be fine. Whereas the cow on the right, now, to meet her nutritional requirements, energy and protein, the pasture by itself is just not going to meet her needs. She needs about 4.5 pounds of corn per head per day. Now we can feed that, but we need to ask ourselves if we're willing to do that. Do we want to do that? So are either of these cows perfect? I'm going to argue neither one of them is. The cow on the right, the 10 pounds of milk, yeah, she's going to maintain her condition, but you know what? We can actually handle a little more milk production in our cow herd. So the bull I might be looking for is in the top 10, 20% of the breed for milk production. So looking at those EPDs for milk, I might be able to go for more milk production in this cow herd to optimize weaning weights. The more milk we produce, and as long as we can feed them, we'll get heavier weaning weights. Now the cow on the right producing 18 pounds of milk, if we want this cow to get rebred, we're going to have to feed that 4.5. And she's probably going to come in to the fall with a much lower condition score. She's going to be looking a little rough. So as far as this herd, I'll probably loosen it up and maybe, we're not pushing milk in the bulls for this herd. We can maybe drop down milk production a little bit. So those are the biggest things. We need to find the animals, be it cattle, sheep, whatever, that matches the forage that we can provide. With that, I'm going to stop sharing. And next speaker can go.
We are going to transition over to Erica's portion of the presentation next. For those of you following along, please put your questions in the Q&A box about meeting animal requirements on pasture. It can be a tricky subject to approach since everyone's situation is slightly different, but don't hesitate to put your questions in the chat. We are here to help you answer those. Erica, I see your screen.
Hi, I'm Erica Lyon, the Agriculture and Natural Resources Educator for OSU Extension in Jefferson and Harrison counties, and I'm going to be covering body condition scoring for nutritional management on pastures. This presentation will ultimately build on Steve's presentation earlier, and we're going to zoom out to look at body condition scoring and why it's so important for nutritional management, especially when we're talking about grazing systems. Body condition scoring, or what we might abbreviate as BCS, is ultimately understanding the degree of fatness or the dietary energy status of an animal. Dietary energy status might actually be a little bit more descriptive than talking about the fatness, but ultimately they're referring to something similar. BCS relates to various key aspects of production, whether this be conception rates, days to estrus, calving intervals, milk production, weaning weights, and parasites and diseases. It can also pertain to percentage of open females, birthing intervals, and vigor of young at birth. When we talk about BCS, it can be tied to forage quality or nutritional value in those grazing systems, and we're going to get into this a little bit later on. Keep in mind that if you are strictly using grazing to meet your animal's nutritional needs, they won't necessarily compare to a BCS of livestock managed under a non-grazing environment. Likewise, it's important to pay attention to the quality of forage provided. For example, if feeding hay of low quality to cattle, they can lose BCS compared to animals fed the same amount of hay that is high quality. Live weights are not really as telling as body condition scores are. They tend to be highly variable, and this is because individuals range in their physiological states, whether this might be age, frame size, muscling, as well as reproductive status or pregnancy status. A cow, for instance, that weighs 600 pounds may have a better body condition score compared to a cow weighing 800 pounds. A fetus in placenta can add an additional 100 pounds to an animal. For any livestock species, gut or rumen fill and fetus development can be difficult to score because these things tend to affect the general shape of that area assessed. Animals may lose condition rapidly later in pregnancy due to the high demands of the fetus, which in turn fuels the need for more high-quality feed to maintain that body condition score. The exact point value of the BCS will depend on the type of management and the stage that that individual is at, whether it be maintenance, breeding, lambing, or calving. One advantage of using BCS to live weights is that BCS can be measured in the field. You don't actually have to bring in the herd and get them on the scales to know their live weights. By using body condition scoring, we can better group animals based on their scores that have been standardized, and then use these to determine which groups get additional supplementation or fed higher quality feedstuffs. Now let's look at what to look for in different livestock species when determining the BCS. Keep in mind that breed can have a major role in how fat is deposited across an animal and can therefore affect scoring. For cattle, you will want to pay attention to the brisket, ribs, back, hooks, and pins, as well as the tail head. Emaciated cattle will have very little muscle or fat in these areas, and the pins and hooks and ribs will be clearly visible. Fat storage often occurs in the brisket area. The back ribs will have a smooth appearance in general due to fat cover, leading to higher body condition scores. The scale for BCS runs from 1 to 9 for beef cattle and 1 to 5 for dairy. In each scale, 1 represents emaciated, while a score of 9 for beef or 5 for dairy signals obesity. When beef cattle are very thin, or what we might call something under a score of 4, they are reproductively inefficient and more susceptible to health problems. BCS of 1 indicates a life-threatening situation that requires immediate attention. Obese cattle, or those that are over a score of 8 or more, are overconditioned and tend to cost more to maintain. Obesity in beef and dairy cattle about 2 years old can lead to calving difficulties since there's too much fat in the pelvic area. There is a video in the livestock species specific section of this module that will show the difference between the two breeds of cattle, along with the general process for obtaining that BCS for beef cattle. Another video will be available that shows a similar process for dairy. The ideal condition score for cattle is 5 to 7 for beef or 3 to 4 for dairy, depending on the stage. This is what we would consider to be a good overall appearance. This table here is a nice summary for weight gain needed to move to the desired BCS for beef cattle. In beef cattle, a single point change in scores is approximately 80 to 100 pounds of live weight, but may range anywhere from 10 to 200 pounds depending on the pregnancy status of a female. In cattle, in order to get from a BCS of 1 to the desired 5 at calving, a cow would need to gain an additional 350 pounds, which is not likely feasible 90 to 100 days prepartum. To go from a BCS of 4 to 5 at calving, with the same time range, a cow would need to gain 150 to 200 pounds. If the cow is at a BCS of 5, it would actually still need to gain an additional weight to make up for the weight of the fetus and the placenta, which is about, remember, 100 pounds. For a cow at a BCS of 7, no weight gain would be needed to be in the ideal 5 to 7 range at calving. An additional 100 pounds is typically gained during the last trimester of gestation for the fetal growth and the uterine development. This is the best time to put condition back on a thin cow or reduce intake of a fat cow. Sheep can be fairly challenging to score due to their coats. Heavy coats are harder to evaluate compared to shorn sheep. The body condition scores for sheep and goats will be based on the prominence of the spine, the amount of fat cover, and the muscle depth, and the characteristics of the transverse process, which will need to be felt in order to be observed. One study found that a range of 7.3 to 35 pounds was needed to change a body condition score by just 1 unit in sheep, and this, of course, depended on the breed. Palpation of the lumbar region, specifically on or around the backbone, or what we call the spinous and transverse processes, right behind the last rib and above the kidneys will need to be done in order to get an accurate BCS. Sheep with a BCS of 1, for example, will have no fat cover, a very prominent sharp spine, and easy to access under the transverse process, which, like the spine, will be sharp. On the flip side, an obese sheep will not have a detectable spine, or maybe just barely, or a transverse process. A thick fat covering will also be present. There are many challenges with scoring small ruminants. For example, young ewes usually will not have as much condition as older ewes since they are still growing. Bone and muscle will develop before fat will be deposited. Because of this, their BCS may be lower even though there is good nutritional management. Excessively fat ewes are less likely to give birth to twins and are more likely to suffer from pregnancy toxemia. Similar to other species, increased fat deposits in the pelvic birth canal can increase difficulty in giving birth. Healthy goats and sheep should have a body condition scoring between 2.5 to 3.5, or some studies suggest up to just under 4.0. Watch the video in the sheep and goat section on how to go about determining the final body condition score. Swine tend to gain weight front to back. The ideal range for gestating sows should be a body condition score of 3 or 4 about 2 weeks prior to farrowing. This conditioning indicates that the growing litter in the sow is adequately nourished and that sow possesses adequate body stores to draw upon when nursing a litter. Sows with a BCS of 5, very much like sheep, goats, and cattle, may experience farrowing complications because they are obese. Body condition is important to track. As indicated on the previous slides, it often correlates with productivity of an individual as well as reproductive performance, especially during calving and the breeding season for cattle. If measuring BCS to gain an idea of rebreeding performance, taking measurements not just at one point in time, but during weaning, before and during parturition, and during breeding can give a better idea of rebreeding performance. The most difficult time to obtain a body condition score is during periods of greater lactation, which occur during and after parturition, since animals typically have higher energy requirements. Periods including late gestation and early lactation will typically be marked by low nutrition and body condition scores that negatively impact performance. Let's take a look at beef cattle. The time scoring usually occurs is during weaning, 60 to 90 days before calving, and during calving, as well as during breeding. The critical times to obtain ABCS is during weaning and calving, although scoring cows in 60 to 90 days before calving allows you to evaluate your dry cow nutritional program, while allowing enough time prior to calving for emergency feeding if needed. Although body condition should be evaluated at parturition, it may be difficult to increase body condition since lactation requires most of the energy an animal consumes. In beef cattle, if environmental conditions at the time of calving are mild, cows may be able to reach a BCS of 5 or 6 by breeding time. However, this is unlikely to occur when weather is cold or high quality feeds are limited. Like with most things, too much or too little is not a good thing. We usually shoot for somewhere in the middle. This table shows the different issues associated with being too much one way or another on the body condition scoring scale. Failure to conceive is the most important factor contributing to the reduction of calves and is a problem associated with both thin and obese beef cattle. Conception rates are dramatically reduced in cows that have a BCS lower than 4, and here we can also see that it is more expensive to maintain an obese cow. If a low BCS is caused by a heavy parasite load, bad teeth or diseases, or even lameness, this is because they are not eating or because the nutrients they are eating are being diverted to the parasites or are essentially lost to diarrhea. So now let's take a look at body condition scoring and how it relates to pregnancy rates as well as costs. So here we have a study that was done back in 1986, so keep in mind these prices are going to be a lot different from what they are now. But in this first group, we have some beef cattle that have a body condition score of 4. If we look at this group, only 50% became pregnant. Whereas if we jump one body condition score point value up to BCS of 5, that number jumps from 50 to 81%. And so on, if we go on to 6, it goes up to 88, and 7 goes up to 90. Whereas if you look at the costs, which are listed below, 133 to 82 to 75 to 74, they go down with increasing body condition score. Of course, this is going up to a certain body condition score. We would expect to see some issues once cattle start getting into that obese range. But overall, we can see that it's good to maintain animals in that BCS 5 to 7 range. BCS should be identified by sorting groups rather than on an individual basis to match feed quality. Thin, moderate, and fat are typical classifications used for sorting individuals into groups. Higher quality feeds go to thinner animals, while lower quality feeds go to the animals with higher BCSs. In most situations, it's not economically feasible to supplement the entire herd if only half of the animals will respond to that higher level of nutrition. So what exactly does this mean for grazing? Well, during the winter months, we often need supplemental feed programs as a primary source of nutrition since crude protein values of forages are often at their lowest point during this time of year. Summer forage conditions are often tied directly to grazing management. When livestock feed on forages, scores for body condition can reflect the quality and quantity of forage that is available to that animal. Take, for instance, cattle that feed on 2 separate bales of hay. One might have high energy content and a good relative feed value, while the other is of poor quality. Even though each bale may look and weigh the same, an individual feeding on the poor quality bale is not getting enough nutritional value from that bale to meet its energy requirements. Consistently feeding on poor quality hay can lead to a lower body condition score overall. The best way to know whether a bale is good quality or poor is to forage test. The accuracy of these tests depend on how well you sample, so contact your county extension office if you need assistance with collecting forage samples. There is also a subsection in this module that covers everything you need to know about forage testing. Using these methods, BCS can be used to inform ourselves how effective our current grazing management system performs. So that's all I have for you today on body condition scoring. There, of course, is a lot more to it, and I would highly recommend that you go explore those species-specific sections here in this module that cover a little bit more specifically how to obtain a BCS. And lastly, these are some really good resources that you can look into to learn a little bit more about body condition scoring. So you don't have to write these all really quickly. I'm going to include a PDF version of this slide set, so that way you should just be able to click on those links directly to access those materials.
All right, so that's all I have. I guess, Christine, do you want to take some questions now, or should we move on to the next group?
Yeah, let's take a couple questions. We are right on time, doing excellent tonight, everybody. Our next presentation is going to be the Fencing Talk by Ted Wiseman. But while we're getting that set up, we did have a question come through in the chat and I typed an answer in there. But if any of our other panelists would like to weigh in, Matt submitted the question, how can we estimate what our ruminants are getting from pasture? Are there book values for nutrient values by plant composition? Or do we want to take a forage sample for pasture analysis? It seems like results would vary widely across the grazing season. Feel free to chime in, panelists.
Yeah, I mean, I would think it would be very important to get a forage test. That's the only way you're going to know the quality of that feed. And there is some research. I don't know specifically off the top of my head what the requirements are for sheep and goats, but I did include a resource in the sheep and goat section that should have that information in it. But if that's something that you're interested in, I can certainly find an answer for you.
Yeah, and Matt, there are programs as well being offered through OSU Extension for specific types of livestock and their specific needs and how to meet them. So whether you're talking about beef or sheep or goats or another type of livestock, make sure that you're checking out the resources from our livestock teams. We have a dairy team, a beef team, sheep and goats. So we have additional experts and presentations outside of the Pastures for Profit course. But Erica's right, there are lots of resources located on Scarlet Canvas. And then most rationing programs or nutrition guidebooks will provide estimates for various feedstuffs, but a forage test is the best way to go. You can do forage tests on fresh samples. So the pasture in my virtual background here, you could take a clipping of that chicory and you could send it in for analysis. But in order for it to get to the laboratory to do the analysis, you'll have to dry it down so that it doesn't rot and mold on the way to the laboratory, unless you have the ability to drop a fresh sample off at a local lab, which some people do have a lab right up the road and could do that. But if you're going to need to mail your sample, you would need to dry it before mailing. I don't see any other pending question. Oh, yes, we do. We have another open question. Is there a body condition score process for poultry?
I was worried someone was going to ask that.
I was texting Jeff in the sidebar to see if there was too, because
yeah, where's Tim McDermott
I'm
when
not
you
sure.
need him?
I think that, I mean, in my experience, I always look for uniformity of the breast tissue on poultry, whether that's turkeys or chickens or guinea fowl or whatever. I'm looking for even deposition of muscle and fat on the animal. So giving the animal a pat down and making sure that both sides are equivalent and that they are either actively gaining weight or actively laying eggs, depending on their purpose. If they're not gaining weight, clearly they're requirements aren't being met or they're ill. And then the same is true if the seasonal conditions are right for laying eggs and they're not laying eggs or there are defects in the eggs, that can be a sign of a nutritional issue that needs to be addressed. But I don't know if there is a specific
I,
criteria of body condition scoring.
I am not aware of one.
Tim did give me a resource that I did post in the poultry section that covers a lot of what you need to know about grazing poultry. So I would recommend checking out, even if there's not a body condition scoring system for poultry, to check that out because it'll have a lot of that information that you need in there.
Great. Denise, I hope that that is helpful in some regard. And feel free to bring that question back in the social hour because knowing that that question's floating around will definitely expand our knowledge base too so we can discuss. Let's go ahead, Erica, and let's move on to our fencing talk with Ted Wiseman. Ted is joining us here, so be prepared with your questions after this video plays.
Good evening. Glad everybody could join us here this evening. My name is Ted Wiseman, Extension Educator in Perry County. Apologize here at the beginning. I'm going to be moving really quick to get through everything we need to get through. Um, so here we go. Before we do anything when we're building a fence, you want to call 811, a call before you dig. You're not going to be bothering these people, which some producers have told me they feel like they're doing. They want you to call them. You're not bothering them because if you get into a situation like this where you cut a fiber wire or fiber line, it's thousands of dollars a day in fines if you didn't make the call. So please make that call. New fence line law changed in 2008. There's a copy of it in your manual, in your packet, or there's spiral bound book that you received. It's in there. And then here's the website for the NRCS standards, what those are for fences. And then briefly just mention the purple post law. This has been on, it's not passed yet, but the legislature did look at it again last year. I don't know where that's at, but this simply means that if you wanted to mark your property lines, you could just take a purple paint and paint fence posts or trees to indicate that that is a property line. You don't have to buy new trespassing signs or anything like that. Again, I don't know where it's at. In the legislature, but if it, as soon as it is passed, we'll let you know. We use the color purple. That way people that are colorblind can still see that color. So what fence you're going to have is going to depend on what kind of livestock you've got, what ages of livestock you've got. If it's horses, you need something visible. With calves, I don't like seeing them out like this. It just makes them harder to train the older they get to keep them in. They get used to going underneath that fence. If you don't have it charged or at the right height, just makes things rougher down the road. With goats, this animal can get its head in and out of that fence just fine. But if that was a horned animal, he'd either get himself hurt really bad trying to get his head back out of there, or he's going to damage your fence. So just be aware that different species, different ages have different fencing requirements. Whole host of different materials out there: woven wire, barbed wire, high tensile, whether you're electrifying or not, wood, steel, recycled plastic posts. The only thing I'll say about those is I've had producers use them, and in the heat of the summer they will bow. Okay. Chargers, probably one of the biggest mistakes that I've made and I've seen others make. Here at the Museum of Fencing done wrong, other place, you name it, I've done it wrong. But chargers do not pay any attention to how many miles they say they're on. Look at the joules. A minimum of 2 joules. If you're going to have a high tensile wire like this with 2 or 3 strands on it, I'd say a 4 joule at minimum. Okay. You can install switches to turn sections on and off. Works great. Solar chargers have gotten a lot better in the last few years. Better batteries, better solar panels. They just have a tendency to on the back 40 to get legs and walk off. These two chargers that I have here, this is a 63 joule. This is a 100 joule. This is the biggest one that I could find. I'm not endorsing anybody or any company. Just letting you know how big you can go. These are pretty pricey. I think this one's about $3 grand. Does come with the remote control though. But these chargers and other companies have them where you can get a tester with them. You can lay this metal piece here on the end right on the fence and it'll tell you which direction the fault is. Another feature that I like it, some of them have, you can lay it on your electric fence, push a button, it'll turn your charger off, make your repairs, fix your fence, do whatever you need to do, then put it back on there and turn it back on if you happen to be on the back 40. I think that's pretty slick. charger like this may take 10 ground rods, and that's our next section. Probably along with chargers, another big mistake that I've made and others is we don't ground our chargers enough. Again, there's a nice article in your books, in your manuals, and it's under all this is under the paddock design, also on some watering systems that Clint talked about. There's some information in there. But I have read 3 foot of grounding rod per joule. I would say at least 3 ground rods, no matter what size of charger you got. 6 foot, 10 foot apart, at least 10 foot is what I'd go with. And then if you've got wire that's not electrified on your fence, ground your charger right to that wire. It'll really help make that circuit work a lot better. And then in this in this particular manual that I was looking at, they recommend if you go more than 1,500 foot away from your charger, to put another ground rod in. Maybe put one on the back 40 just to help in dry years to make that circuit work better. Stray voltage, not as big an issue it used to be. Of course, we don't have as many dairies as we used to be, is where we've really seen a lot of it. But you don't want to install that charger close to your utilities where they're coming in. Kind of keep them 50 foot apart is the example they give in this fact sheet that I found. Especially if you got metal pipe into your water tanks, it can be a conduit of electric. So just be aware. I mean, it doesn't take much less than a half a volt, it'll cause affect performance of those livestock because they'll back off the water. Use the right wire, lead out and underground cables. Copper wire, we couldn't afford it to use it for electric fence anyway, but high tensile wire is designed to carry the charge on the outside of the wire. Copper carries it on the inside. And you don't want to mix the types of wires up. I once made the mistake of using a piece of copper to make a jumper in a corner to 2 electric wires, and the copper started corroding the high tensile wire, so I had to take it off. But you want good, clean connections. And if you are going to install some of this underground wire, especially under driveways, I'd put it through a piece of junk plastic pipe that you got just to help protect it even more. Wire types, whole different host types of these: poly wires, poly ropes, poly tapes. This poly netting has worked well for some folks here in the county. That it's only the horizontals that are electrified, but they've used them with really good success for rotational grazing with sheep and goats. It worked out well. Barbed wire, you don't want to electrify barbed wire because every time that electric comes to one of those barbs, it won't short it out, but it just kind of takes some of the juice out of it. It's kind of like imagining water flowing through a line, and then it comes to dead ends every so often. It just won't flow real good. The gripples, I'll talk about them later, but there are 2 different sizes of those. I've used them. They got some good points and some bad points, but we'll get to that here in a minute. Post selections, step in post, wood post, steel post. You can use them in combinations. Here you can see they've got these steel posts with pigs inside hog panels, and probably had to put the electric fence in there because hogs, they'll root up anything. I don't care how many steel posts you got in there, they'll pull them up out of the ground and go under it. So that's probably why they had to put the electric in there. But all kinds of different selections there that you can use. Staples and staple placement, probably another big area that I've made several hundred mistakes putting these in over the years. But we have 2 different kinds of staples. We've got a right cut or right-handed staple, or a left cut or a left-handed staple. Most of them that I've seen around my area have been the right-handed ones. And the way you can tell is if you lay that staple on your hand, the palm of your hand, with these points sticking away from you, pointing away from your body. If that cut edge is up and is on the right side, that's a right-handed staple. Okay. The right-handed staple, you want to tilt it to about 2 o'clock or a 30 or 45-degree angle and drive that staple in. And what that does is it forces, when you drive that staple in, these barbs go away from each other, giving you a much stronger anchor with that staple than if you put it in backwards. They would cross over. And if you put the wire on the wrong side of the fence, they're going to push them right out. Okay. I really like these. I use 1.5-inch, the double board staples, especially if you're using treated wood posts. They're real soft. These seem to do a pretty good job for me. Um, but personal preference there. Insulators, again, whole big variety of selections, colors, and types out there. These insulators, these little tubes that wrap around the end of your corner posts, they do work. The only downfall is that over time, they will start to crack. I've got some that are 20, 25 years old, and they're starting to crack and short out on the posts. So what I'm doing is coming back in and putting these bullnose insulators in. Learn how to tie high tensile wire. It's not that hard, that difficult to do, especially for these two just simple knots that you can use. The porcelain bull nose insulators probably last you a little longer than the plastic ones. They're a little more expensive. Just if you drop them on the shop floor, they don't hold up real well. That's another area here at the museum that we've done. But again, a whole different types of selections out there for whatever insulator you need, whether it's steel post, wood post, you name it. Corner post, probably the number one area that I've messed up before and others that I've seen. You need to do it right or you're going to be doing it over, especially if you're using high tensile wire. But for all fence, it doesn't matter. This one's close to being right. I can't really tell from the picture, but this one is installed correctly. But the rule of thumb is whatever your post height is, say this is a 4 foot post, you want 2.5 times that in your horizontal. So if it's 4 foot, we'll need a 10 footer here. And this just looks like a regular fence post, but I may be wrong. Some other, I mean, if you don't do it, if you don't have those long enough, this is what you're going to wind up with. It's going to pull that corner right out of there. Okay. There are other different ways of doing it. I'm not saying it's right or wrong or indifferent. It's just what you've got to work with. And this is probably out west where they're dealing with a lot of rock. With corner posts, this one is probably about the only thing that I've done right on my place. You can see this is 10 foot, 4 foot up. But another thing that I've done is put a peg on the other side of that post. So when that gate's open, it'll hold that gate up and it'll also keep it open. Another thing that I've done in the past few years is say the gate's coming around to this side of the post, take another one of those old screw-in gate pegs and screw it into the post here. So when you close that gate, you can set this pipe right over top of that pin to help hold it in place. Whether you got a chain on it or not, it'll still hold it there. And another nice thing is when the neighbor kids come over and they climb over your gate and they don't climb over it on the inside, it'll keep them from bending it too, and you from having to yell at them. The double H braces here will work. Not a big fan of them. You got to make sure you got these 3 posts in line and you got these horizontals perfectly in alignment. If you got these in the middle here a little too high, it's going to push that post right up out of the ground. Or if you got them misaligned, it's going to push this post one way or the other. So not a big fan. Post spacing and size going to depend on the terrain, what type of fence you've got. You can space them out and use some of these spacers here. They're not on the ground. Fiberglass or wood won't short out your fence. Um, Again, just going to depend on the fence type and the terrain. Fence tension, different kinds of tensioners. Those are ratchets. There's 2 different kinds out there. This one you can just put a wrench on it. Some of the others are rounded on both sides and it takes a special tool to tighten them up. Here's another gripple again. Takes a special tool to tighten them. The only downfall I have of these is I've got some between the pasture field and the hay field, a couple strands of electric fence on it, and deer can't see that electric fence, and they run right through the fence and they'll strip these out. So you got to have an eye on them, keep them there. Daisy wheels work fine. Takes a special tool to tighten them up, and you want to make sure you got a good grip on it because it gets away from you. It could smack you in the jaw and it hurts. And here's a chain tightener here, smooth wire tightener, work pretty slick. How tight do we need to make our tent fence? With woven wire, most of them will say these tension curves, you want to flatten them out a third to a half of what they are when you pull that fence up. If you really want to get technical about it, they sell these devices here that you put on the fence. This little spring right here is under the wire, and as you tighten it, it'll tell you how tight it is or how much tension you've got on it. These springs, if you tighten them an inch, they claim it's 150 pounds. I've seen some recommendations of 200, 250 pounds of tension on high tensile. And boy, if you go that high, you better have good corner posts. That's a lot of tension, folks. 100 is probably where I would more likely stay at. If you got runs of greater than 600 foot, you want your ratchets or your tighteners in the middle of it, especially if it's not a straight run. Just put these up, a couple different new ratchets that I've come across. This one's got the bullnose insulator right on the end. And this one I really like. They're designed where you could put the wire and tie it off around here, but this one's designed, it's got a hole in the end right here. You can just slide a wire right through it. You don't have to cut it. It'd be a lot better if you've got electric connections on that wire. Gate placement, moving livestock. You don't want the gates in the center. You want them in the corners. Makes it a lot easier. This application here happens to be an alleyway here, so they've got 2 gates in, so whichever direction they're bringing the livestock, they can swing that gate open and help direct the livestock in there. Make sure you got them high enough to keep the pets off the top of your fence. Then we've all got that one that decided you've got a fence or a gate that you didn't put in correctly, so they're going to make their own gate. We've all had them before. Wildlife issues. Can be a problem. Coyotes probably our biggest one. We don't have bear here, but if you're raising specialty crops, deer can be an issue, and that's pretty expensive. Put in a 9 foot fence, but if you got high dollar crops, it pays. So just wrapping up here, in your manual and paddock design, there's some information there. Don't make sure you go in there and look at it. But look to your neighbors, look to your local producers, fencing companies, see what works for them. Hopefully one day we'll get back to doing field days. But Farm Science View, there's a lot of fence dealers there, different resources we have online. And then if you really get desperate, you can contact us, the extension. There's my contact information there. I said that jokingly, but be glad to help out and give you any information that I possibly can. Thank you.
Thank you, Ted, for that presentation on fence. We do have some questions here in the Q&A. Let's take at least one of those while we switch over to Clint's presentation on water systems. Ted, do you want to go ahead and answer this question about solar chargers? Do you have any experience with newer, larger solar chargers and how they may compare with a typical charger?
But like I said there in my auctioneering speech, the solar ones have gotten better. Um, the the biggest thing is making sure you've got a good battery on them. Is from what I've seen with them, I haven't had a lot of experience with them just because I've had a couple of them and they've run off. So I stick to the ones that I can plug in and secure pretty well. But the newer ones are better. But just make sure you've got them grounded good and got a good battery with them.
Good advice, Ted. Let's save these other two questions either for discussion live after Clint's presentation, or Ted, if you want to go ahead and write some replies in the chat box.
Yeah,
We
I'll
can take
reply and I'll
those.
try to get on for the social hour, Christine. So I'll be available then, or they've got my contact and feel free to contact me. So
Okay, awesome. Thank you, Ted. Let's go ahead and get started now on our presentation for water systems.
Hello, everyone. My name is Clint Finney. I'm a soil conservation technician for the Natural Resource Conservation Service. Currently in Hopedale, Ohio. I cover Jefferson and Harrison counties and help out with Carroll and Tusk when needed. And I'm here today to talk to you about the importance of water in a grazing system. First off, I have to admit that I borrowed some of these slides from a presentation I believe Jeff McCutcheon did for the grazing schools years ago. But I thought this one was powerful enough that I wanted to keep it in there. It says that water is the most powerful force determining where livestock will spend their time. And of course we're talking about fence tonight, and fence of course plays a role in where livestock will spend their time as well. But the water will tend to be the concentration point. It'll tend to be the place where the animals gather, and so we want to ensure in a grazing system that we've got water nearby the grass that we're currently wanting the livestock to graze, because that will keep them in that area. In any water discussion, I think it's important for us to realize how much water our livestock actually drink. Just with grazing as well, I always like to point out how much forage our livestock actually consume in a day. I think it's important for us to realize how much water they actually do consume. So y'all can read those slides, but you see that most all of them or all of them have a range there, and that range, of course, is dependent on the size of the livestock. It's also dependent on temperature, humidity, um, and a lot of other factors as well. With beef cattle, dairy cattle, sheep, even it matters whether they're lactating currently or not. It's real important for us to realize how much water our livestock are actually going to consume. And in my business, where I'm sizing water systems and designing water systems, I need to keep this in mind because I need to make sure that that delivery is enough water for the livestock. And as we're talking about animal requirements, we also would like to keep the walking distance to water at somewhere less than 800 feet, just because their efficiencies go way down when our livestock have to walk further than 800 feet to water. Another slide I borrowed from Jeff's presentation there, but this just shows the utilization rate based on distance that livestock have to walk to water. And that's where we get this that 800-foot idea. I had a producer years ago tell me, I don't care whether they have to walk 2 miles, they're going to walk to water. Yes, that's true, but how efficiently are they going to graze 2 miles away from a water source? They're just not. They're going to take 5 or 6 bites, let's say, to get to that far distance from a water trough, and they're going to take 5 or 6 bites to get back to that water trough. So their efficiency goes way down. Have seen it in my own fields. I've seen it in lots of pasture fields that I've walked over the years. Close to water, the forage is grazed really close. And the further we get away, the taller the forage gets, especially in a continuous grazing operation. So we want to make sure we keep that water within 800 feet, and preferably closer if we can, just to keep their grazing efficiencies as high as we possibly can. My Eastern Ohio Grazing Council folks know that I include these slides in a lot of presentations I do just because I think they're powerful. These are from the original grazing school. I'm not sure where they got the data or where they did it, but it shows the manure distribution away from a water trough, and this is in a 3 paddock system, and we would typically be looking at this in soil fertility, and I know y'all are going to talk about or have talked about soil fertility, but the manure distribution also tells us a little bit about the grazing distribution and where those livestock spend their time. And in this instance, where the water trough is over 800 feet to the end of the paddock, and there's the trees on the other end of the paddock, it shows where those livestock are spending their time, where they're attracted to. And this just tells me that we need to have those water troughs more centrally located in those fields, so that the livestock spend more of their time in those outlying areas. One more of those slides, again, more soil fertility based, but this is then a 24 paddock grazing system, walking distances just over 400, maybe 500 feet. And it shows the manure distribution in those fields. And therefore, we can kind of say, well, the grazing distribution is about the same. Um, and those watering troughs being shorter distance, means that the grazing efficiency is a lot better in a situation like this where there's less walking distance to water. Now we're going to get into water sources. And I'm going to spend some time here on each one of these because we're talking to a large area, and some areas of the state have more instances of these different water sources than others. But um, ponds, in my area of the state, we don't use ponds very often because the only ponds we really have are what was left over from the strip mining operations. Our soils just aren't conducive to building ponds and holding water. But if we're going to use a pond, we want to do one of two things. We either want to build a gravel access lane or some sort of access lane into the pond and fence the pond out so that the livestock aren't entering the pond at will wherever they want to. And so they're not camping out there and spending time there. Or we want to put a pipeline through the dam and drain it downhill to either some sort of pumping platform or to a trough below the pond, so that our livestock don't have to enter the pond to get water. I prefer, if we have the opportunity, put a pipe through the dam and run water off site, off away from that pond. But if we have to, we can use the pond access point, especially if we don't have access to ground below the dam of the pond. Streams can also be used as a water source, although I'll be quite honest, it's a sticky subject. There's a lot of streams that we probably need to be thinking about fencing out, or at least fencing in such a way that the animals have limited access to the stream, just to prevent environmental issues with the stream bank and the stream itself, and leaving manure in the stream. But streams can be used for water. In most instances, we would like to put some sort of access point. And you can see from the picture there in the slide, this producer has an access point into the stream. It's sized with bigger rocks, so the cows don't like to hang out there, and there's shade in that field and other places, so they hang out in other places. And he has that stream fenced off almost completely, except for this little short section that he allows access to water. I'm in no way saying that we should fence off all streams. I think that we can use our stream corridors for grazing. We just have to be environmentally conscious about it. It has to be used in such a way that it's not going to create an environmental hazard, because the livestock are hanging out there and spending too much time in that stream. And So that takes management, and that's what we're talking about here is managed grazing, and we need to manage those streams if we're going to use them for water to make sure that we don't cause problems for someone further down the stream or for ourselves. The next one I'll talk about is springs or seeps. Here in my part of the state, that's kind of what we use for stock water almost everywhere. But a word of caution with springs, they can be very expensive to put in. I think our average cost around here is about $3,500 a spring. I've seen spring developments that were in excess of $20,000 to put in. So when I go out and work with a producer and they want to show me 6 or 8 springs and they want to develop springs all over the place for paddocks, I tend to try to talk them into let's find your best spring or your best spring that's nearest to electricity. Let's develop that spring and then put in some sort of pumping platform and put in pressurized water lines so that we can put water exactly where we want it. And that's a problem with springs in general, developing a bunch of springs, is that springs don't typically happen in places water. Here in eastern Ohio, we have lots of uplands that are as grazable as good pasture land, and our springs typically are down the hill and near a stream of some sort in some kind of environmentally sensitive area. So if I'm working with a producer and we're looking at a bunch of springs, I like to be able to develop one good one and pump it and put it into a pressurized water system. After that, we have a lot of producers that water cattle off of a well. It takes a good one. It takes a well that's going to supply the amount of water we need per minute to be able to water the livestock. But there again, we can use a well and run a pressurized water system away from the well and out through the grazing system and put troughs where we want them instead of the water being where it is in the case of a pond or a stream or even multiple spring developments. And then I even have producers that use public water source. Most of them have some other sort of system they use, a well or a spring, but they have backup on the public water. And there again, that would be under pressurized system that would take water out to the field. Talk just a minute about pumps. There's lots of pumping options. Um, if we're talking about a pressurized system, something that I'm going to design is typically going to be something electrical, something's going to use electricity. We've also put in solar pumps over the years, depending on where we're at and if we're far away from electric. I've seen systems, and I even had a system at one time that ran off of a gasoline pump. We pumped from a spring tank up the hill and to a cistern at the top, and that cistern then was the supply line and created the pressure that then fed the rest of our system. And there are also ram pumps and bilge pumps and sling pumps. Those are all kind of site specific. In certain areas, they work great, and others not so well. So, if you're interested in some other sort of pumping system, it's best to work with one of us to kind of figure out what system works best for you. I also have hauling water in there under the pumping options, and there are grazers that put together these kind of wagons and haul water to their livestock. I will say that most of them grow tired very fast of hauling water. It takes a lot of time, it takes a lot of energy, but it can be used in the short term with a grazing system if we need to be. But for the most part, folks that haul water eventually figure out some other way to put in some sort of pressurized system to get water to their livestock. And while we're on that subject, I think some of the best grazing systems we have some sort of pressurized water to be able to put water where we want it and where we want to focus the livestock's grazing. So often our other water sources, ponds, streams, springs, are not where we want the livestock to be or where we want the water to be. So when we put in some sort of pressurized system, we then choose where to put that water facility to be able to graze our pastures more efficiently. And that can be with underground water line or it can be with overland water line, depending on our time of need and use and as far as freezing goes. But our best systems put in some sort of pressurized system and it will pay for itself in the grazing efficiency that we will see from that. Just a second on sizing pipe. If we're going to put in some sort of pressurized system, I see a lot of questions or have a lot of questions come through about what size our pipe should be. And just so you know, we can figure that for you. Those of us at Soil and Water Extension and NRCS would be glad to look at your system, measure your pipelines, and tell you what size. There's nothing worse than going out and buying a certain size pipe and putting it in and then finding out it's not big enough. So we'd be happy to look over your system and figure out what size pipe you need if you're going to put in a pressurized water system for your grazing system. Kind of quickly, I want to go over my kind of water dues, the things that we want to do with water. We want water in every paddock, and that doesn't have to be every individual. It can be kind of split between one or two. I see lots of producers split water between four, and I would rather split it between two so that I have one more opportunity to split those paddocks up if necessary. Four works if that's the way it's got to be, but I prefer to only have two paddocks to each trough if I can help it. I like to keep water within 500 to 600 feet, just because I don't want those animals to have to walk very far. Don't want skinny, thin paddocks either. I'd rather have them more square than long rectangles. Smaller tanks with quick recharge. You can see me standing there above one of the tanks that I use for cattle. I actually have 5 or 6 of these that I move around. That's a Job float there out of that trough. It's about 50 gallons, but it recharges, fills, but rather quickly. And in our system, it works great. Only one or two cows come at one time. And then also be concerned about how much of the pasture can your livestock physically see from the water source, or vice versa, because that's going to make a huge impact on how often or how many animals come to that water trough at one particular time. And then my water no-nos. This picture gets passed around. I have no idea where it even came from. I've seen it a million times, but there's lots of problems in this picture. A water trough near a stream with a mineral feeder right next to the water trough and a tree. So that becomes a huge nutrient magnet right there next to the stream. One of the big no-nos when it comes to grazing and water management. But no pie-shaped paddocks. We don't want to create a pie shape for the same reason we don't want animals walking a long distance, because their efficiency is going to be way off on the outside ends of the pie, out near the crust. If you're visualizing that, and they're going to be way overgrazed near the water system. Plus, you're also going to have nutrients loading near that water tank and not out far away from it. No permanent travel lanes to water, and this goes hand in hand with the pie-shaped paddocks. We don't want to have permanent travel lanes because they then become trails, which in our part of the state eventually become gullies. No matter how you do it, there's always going to be a slope at some point that's going to run water down those paths, and they're eventually going to become gullies. Now, I've used temporary lanes when I had to, but those were lanes that I didn't ever go back to and didn't ever use again. I always made sure they walked a different path the next time they grazed those fields. We need to make sure that we have enough space for the stock to drink, depending on how far they have to walk for water, how many livestock are in that field at any particular time, and how much water is recharging in that tank. And then we have to make sure we have enough recharge between drinking events. We have to make sure that that tank is going to be full the next time the next group of livestock visit the tank. Well, I'm going to take this opportunity to thank you all for listening in here on my part. Also, for more information, don't hesitate to call your local extension office, NRCS office, Soil and Water Conservation District. We are here for help. We'd be glad to work with you and look over your grazing system and figure out what is the best way to provide water to your livestock. Thank you very much.
Hello, my name is
Thank you, Clint, for joining us tonight and for presenting on all those various water systems that can work for your applications. All of us are in a slightly different situation at home, and what works for our neighbor may or may not work for us. We've been seeing some conversation in the chat as well as the Q&A about various types of water systems, and also some fencing questions still that we would like to answer. Clint, I see that Ted and Bob are having some discussion about drinking water posts. I don't personally have any experience with those. They certainly look like an interesting option. Do any of our other panelists have experience with drinking water posts? Maybe any more of our classmates that have experience with drinking water posts? If you do, feel free to share your experience in the chat, what you like or dislike. Um, I did find some distributors here while watching the conversation in the chat of where you can get in contact with someone to install one. While we are thinking on that question, Ted, let's go back to that question about fencing along a creek. Clint and Ted, would you like to answer this one together? Things that are good, things that are bad in relation to fencing by creeks.
I clicked on the wrong button there, and I apologize to Erica on that. But yeah, Erica, you can fence along them, and Clint would have a lot of information. You can put in areas where they can cross those creeks. Really don't want them just meandering through the entire creek, especially if it looks like you're along a residential area. We don't want those stream banks to become eroded, getting manure and mud in the creek. People see with their eyes and hear with their eyes and that kind of deal. But yeah, you can graze along them. I mean, I've got several of them, and if you're in any government programs, a lot of times they're going to want you to fence them out of them. But there's some really neat things that NRCS and soil and water have to help back that water up a little bit to put in drinking areas on them. But I'll defer to Clint on this one here too. So go ahead, Clint.
Sorry, I was having some technical difficulties there as well. Can we repeat the question quick?
You're muted, Christine.
Look at us, technical difficulties all around. Yeah, Clint, let's read that question out loud. So this comes from Erica, and Erica says, I have some pasture that I need to fence where one side slopes down to a creek. I hate to fence out a natural water source, but the other side is open to a residential area and a higher ridge that can't be fenced or maintained. Is it okay to fence along the creek, or do you have any other suggestions?
Sure, it'd be all right to fence along the creek. If we're going to use the creek as a water source, we would want to put some kind of stream access point in, gravel, geotextile fabric, that kind of point, just to be able to use that creek efficiently and not create a point where the livestock are going to spend all their time down there in the creek, especially on a hot day. We might fence the creek out depending on what we're seeing and what we're doing and what our livestock are going to do. If we find it's going to be a problem, it may become something that we'd want to fence out. But we can use that stream for a water point as long as we're smart about it and we do it environmentally conscious.
Thank you. And Erica, if you have any follow-up to that question, feel free to submit another one in the Q&A box. Continuing with the waterways discussion, Vince asks the question, what is the general consensus on grazing grassed waterways? They have a gully ravine at their farm that could be graded, but tentatively still convey water as needed, but they want to allow for grazing, yet not contribute to soil erosion. What's our general consensus on grazed waterways?
Well, I'll weigh in. That's a tough subject. It's kind of a site-specific topic too. It's something that I, for one, would like to put eyes on just to know one way or the other what the area looks like and what we're dealing with. In a lot of instances, we could graze a waterway if it's able, if we can. We would just want to put a lot of management to that. We wouldn't want them in it all the time. We'd want to graze them quick and get them out of it. And it also depends on if that is, hopefully that waterway isn't in some sort of government program where it's not allowed to be grazed. But I think if we're going to graze a specific grassed waterway, we want to make sure that there's management that's going to go along with that to make sure they're not going to ruin the grass waterway for its intended purpose.
Right. What comes to my mind is temporary fence. Short periods in when the soil conditions are, favorable, and then the exclusion is probably the way they could utilize it. But I agree with Clint. The ability to see it and look at the needs of the whole farm operation and opportunities to use it needed to be included in this discussion.
Thank you, guys. Let's go to this next question from Melissa. Can you address the difference between tensioning high tensile versus electric and cracking insulators?
Yeah, I will say with insulators, Melissa, I'm not saying you buy the most expensive ones, but you want to buy the better ones. You can really put a lot of tension on high tensile wire if you want to electrify it. The ceramic ones I like better. There's some really good plastic ones out there, but just don't overdo the tensioning on them. The ones I was talking about that wrap around the post, they work for a few years, but I'm going to the bull nose ones because I can just tie that high tensile wire off around that post, and if they go bad, then I can replace them. Makes it a little easier.
We've now addressed all the pending questions. So if anybody has any additional questions, feel free to contribute those now. They don't have to be directly related to tonight's topics even. It could be something that you were pondering in the sidebar during tonight's presentations, or something that may have came up as a result of the social hour. We welcome you to contribute those. And I was just about to ask Erica if she Erica, would you mind checking what the Qualtrics results are thus far to see if we could potentially pick our date before the webinar ends for social hour?
Sure. Let me try to log in real quick. I accidentally exited out.
While she's doing that, Christine, I will just say that anybody that's on here, if you're looking at fencing or tying high tensile knots that I talked about, there's a ton of YouTube videos out there from fence builders, fence companies, just building fence. Some are extensions, some are not, but there's a ton of them out there and tying all the different kinds of knots on high tensile wire. It's worth checking out. So I'll leave you with that resource as well.
Thank you, Ted. We've also been fortunate before to have corresponding field days down here in Noble County when we've had fence go in at the research station. And that is always a really cool opportunity to come out and watch the fencing professionals put up fence and ask them questions. So if you ever see that opportunity occurring in your community, make sure that you schedule some time to go out and take a look. Um, that's some of the best learning experience that you can access. And we are sad that we didn't have the opportunity to do that in 2020, but looking forward, we hope to offer that again in the future.
So Christine, it's a tie between February 18th and February 25th.
Okay. Given that it is a tie at this point, I think let's send that link out again after we have the recordings posted, so that anyone who may choose to watch the recordings could also weigh in on social hour. But keep those dates in mind then, as those will likely be the ones left in the running.
It
We will
does look like a
communicate.
Thursday will be better for the most part.
Okay. We will communicate the final selection with enough time for you to prepare and get it on the calendar. And we hope that if you weren't able to join us last time, that you will this time. Just as a review, the social hour, it doesn't have a set agenda. It's just us together in a meeting room. You'll have the ability to have your mic on, your camera on, and just socialize with the other people in the class, as well as whatever panelists are able to be on that evening as well. We know that that's part of the Pastures for Profit course that you're not able to get in this virtual setting, but we'll do our best to provide it in some way, shape, or form. I see, to build off of that drinking post water discussion, Bob says that Timeless Fence System is selling them. I have seen lots of ads from Timeless Fence, but I haven't seen the sales pitch on the drinking water posts. We did have a little bit of discussion. Melissa Miller had said in the chat that since they don't have a reservoir system, that sometimes the animal can walk up and drink all the water and then still be thirsty, but there's not a reservoir there to draw from. If I'm reading that correctly. We do have a question too about how do you deal with algae in waterers? That's a good question. I get this question a lot. Clint, Ted, what are your ideas?
Number one, it would depend on what species. You will see things out there on putting copper in it. Sheep are much more sensitive to copper than cattle. There's different ways of handling it. Again, I know y'all hate hearing us when we say an extensioner from the government, it depends, but I would like to come out and see that watering system to address it. There's been different ways of handling, but if you are going to use copper, I would just use extreme caution with the species that you have.
I'm glad Ted used the "it depends" answer before I got to it. That breaks the ice, so I don't have to. Um, it really does depend on what's out there and what algae and what problem is it causing you. You know, if it's a spring tank, we can put an overflow on there that keeps the algae from going down and plugging up the outlet. I've seen folks put goldfish in the tanks, and sometimes that works if you can keep the raccoons from eating the goldfish. I've seen people put barley straw in there. That's a kind of a copper thing too. It all depends on what that algae is and what problem it's causing you. It depends. The answer then depends on that.
I see Richard says in the chat, routine cleaning with bleach does help in open rubber tanks. Yeah, there is a specified ratio of how much bleach per gallons of water that you use. I don't have that chart in front of me, but you definitely don't want to overdo it with the bleach, but you want to use enough that it actually has an effect to take care of the algae. But it's a fairly small a rate per gallon in your tank. So you do need to figure out how big your tank is before you go and add that bleach treatment to the waterer. Another thing, just to throw out there, uh, public water systems have considered this option before and it hasn't worked out because it was too expensive. But have any of you seen the advertisements for the black floating balls that float on the surface of the water? And because the water is then shaded, the algae doesn't grow in it. That's an interesting concept. I think has potential, but right now, every single one of those balls costs between I think 60 cents to $1.50, and you would need a lot of them to cover the surface of a sizable water tank. So probably not economically feasible. I know that I would be stuck scrubbing the tank instead of going that route. The follow-up to the algae question is it's growing in my fountain waterers.
With mine that I have, you just got to drain them and clean them every once in a while, especially if you don't have a lot of animals drinking out of them. I've even got them on municipal water on one of them, and it'll still build up in them. So just shut them off, drain them, clean them, keep them clean.
Yeah, I'd echo that. That's unfortunately it's one of the hard parts about a water system is it takes some routine cleaning, some routine maintenance to just keep that stuff at bay.
I don't see any other pending questions right now in Q&A or in the chat. So at this point, we'll just hang on here for a couple more minutes, and I'd like to thank all of our panelist speakers tonight. Excellent job compiling a lot of information in a short period of time today. And thank you for joining us. Thank you for coming back for webinar 2. And as a reminder, webinar 3 will be on March 3rd. And just like this time, the module that pairs with webinar 3 will open the day prior on March 2nd so that you can access all of the resources that pair with that webinar. If you haven't logged into Scarlet Canvas, we highly suggest you go and check that out. Erica, maybe it would be a good idea in case some people missed the beginning introduction to show them Canvas one more time.
Sure. Let me see. Might need to bring it up again.
Another quick reminder, if you have not paid the course fee and you want to receive either a binder or a USB drive in the mail of the traditional course curriculum, please pay your fee right away because we are running short on materials. But if you want a set of materials, we want to make sure that you get a set. So it would be ideal if you could go on to the payment website and pay tonight so that we could compile the rest of our list tomorrow. But we're all caught up on everyone who has currently paid, and there should only be 5 of you left that haven't gotten your materials in the mail yet. Okay, Erica, I can see it.
All right. So when you first get into Scarlet Canvas, you'll actually start off in the dashboard. When I'm in student view, I can't access the dashboard, but it will have like a card associated with it that says Pastures for Profit. You're going to click on that and it'll take you to this page. Our current announcements are up at the top. This is the home page. If you scroll down and click on the giant Access Modules button, it will take you to the modules. One thing I realized that might be kind of confusing is these little arrows, like your modules might initially be collapsed, so you might have to uncollapse them to actually see the pages. We should now be able to see the Science of Grazing. So if you click on the first page there, starting hopefully soon, this page will start having the recordings on it. If you scroll all the way down to the bottom, we have got some topic specific information that you can click on those buttons and learn about these topics. So for example, we briefly hinted at forage analysis, but I highly recommend that you take a look at the forage analysis section. So if you click on that, it'll open in a new window, and then you would just go through the additional videos and accompanying material. Also with the second module, if you click next, it will take you to a livestock species specific page. So for those of you who are specializing in one or another or are thinking about getting into multi-species grazing, I would recommend checking out those buttons as well. And then of course, like our last module, we do have some virtual pasture walks thanks to the Eastern Ohio Grazing Council. So once again, if you have any questions on that, please feel free to let me know. I am more than happy to walk you through how to use Scarlet Canvas if you're running into any issues with that.
Thank you, Erica. I hope that everyone enjoys the rest of the materials that are offered. And as we mentioned, we'll let you know when the next social hour is and hope to see you then. I did want to share, I did find an extension resource that states the appropriate rate of bleach should be 2 to 3 ounces unscented bleach per 50 gallons of water. Okay, well, with that, I don't see any other questions that have come in the meantime. Again, thank you all. Thank you to all our panelists and all of our returning classmates for joining us tonight. And we look forward to seeing you again next time virtually. We will hang on here while attendees leave. If anybody has any additional questions that you want to stay on and ask after the recording ends, we'll stay on for a few more minutes, okay? Thank you so much. Have a great night.
Thanks, everyone.